from Dublin where I said, quote, "I know my father." And I believe that. The kids know. The kids have to choose sides in domestic violence. The kids almost always are on the side of the victim, their mother. Some of the kids stop talking to their fathers. Sometimes long after the violence is over, the kids reconcile with their fathers. But they always know. They always know the truth. And I, for one, am sure that Ivanka Trump has absolutely no doubt about who she believes, her father or her mother. The Washington Post's Ruth Marcus will give us her reaction to the Ivanka Trump interview next. Joining our discussion now is Ruth Marcus, deputy editorial page editor and columnist at the Washington Post. And Ruth, this was an extensive interview that Peter Alexander did with Ivanka Trump, and there's much to react to in it, and I leave it open to you to pick anything you want.
Well, a few things. First of all, I think we once again see Ivanka's Trump. She just has to live in this kind of fantasy land where things that happen didn't happen, where her father is a staunch defender of any woman who might have been the subject or victim of domestic abuse, and so therefore in the White House, the minute they found out about it, they reacted really strongly and immediately, and of course he was appalled. At one point in the interview, Peter says, well, but it took him 10 days to respond, and maybe it was 9, maybe it was 10, depending on when you start counting. And Ivanka Trump's answer to that is, well, that's not really my understanding of it, or I don't think that that's what happened. And you can say, I don't think that that's what happened all you want, but that is what happened. It took him 10 days to choke out, it shouldn't have to be said. And in the interim, he talked about Rob Porter, about what a good job he'd done in the White House and what a brilliant career he would have ahead of him. So that's point number one. Point number two, I think, would be, even leaving aside whatever happened between Ivanka Trump's mother and her father, the way she responded to that question was just so telling and really a little bit galling to me, because she's asked this question and she says that's a very inappropriate, pretty inappropriate question to ask a daughter. And it may be an inappropriate question to ask a daughter. Daughters, you know, have loyalty to their fathers. Daughters love their fathers even if they're flawed. And that is exactly why daughters shouldn't be working in their fathers' White Houses. And if they're going to be working in their fathers' White Houses and refusing or chafing at answering questions like that, maybe they shouldn't be working on things like women's issues and protecting women and families. So I had a little bit of a give me a break response to the whole interview.
Yeah, and the reason we know about her mother's accusation against her father is that her mother made that accusation under oath in a deposition. And if the Trump divorce had gone into a full-blown litigation, it could easily have
trouble.
The name dominating national headlines for more than 2 weeks.
I'll work across party lines to create jobs and get wages up.
What we're getting nationally is, Alabamians would vote for a pedophile over a liberal Democrat.
I wouldn't vote for the baby killer for hell or high water.
Well, good morning to you. I'm Christy Paul, and with us today,
I'm Martin Savage in for Victor Blackwell. Great to be with all of you.
What a Thanksgiving it is, Martin. Thank you.
Chaos brewing at the agency that has a huge impact on helping safeguard your finances.
Yeah, at the stroke of midnight, the man heading the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Richard Cordray, stepped down. The question is who's going to replace him as of Monday. Well, that depends on who you ask. A lot of confusion this morning over who is leading the top U.S. consumer watchdog agency, and here's why. President Trump tapped White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney to be interim chief of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or CFPB. The announcement came, though, just hours after the outgoing director, Richard Cordray, an Obama appointee, formally resigned and named his chief of staff, Leandra English, the successor, which essentially makes her the acting director. The appointments of two officials to the same post sets up a political and legal clash here, and the question of who's in charge when employees return to work on Monday. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, who helped create the CFPB, tweeted this: "The Dodd-Frank Act is clear. If there's a CFPB director vacancy, the deputy director becomes acting director. Donald Trump can't override that. But the administration can appoint a current government official into a new job as long as they're confirmed by the Senate under the Federal Vacancies Act to serve in an acting capacity." So the CFPB was created after the 2008 financial crisis to protect consumers and keep an eye on Wall Street. Republicans argue the agency has too much power, not enough oversight, and establishes what they see as anti-business regulations. Mulvaney's been a longtime critic. While serving in Congress, he voted in favor of killing the agency and once called it a sick and sad joke. President Trump will ultimately nominate a permanent director. The opening is a chance for a major overhaul of the Bureau.
So what does the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau actually do for you? According to the Joint Economic Committee on Capitol Hill, the watchdog group has several accomplishments, aside from just taking on Wall Street. More recently, it forced Wells Fargo to pay full refunds to customers after employees set up those phony accounts. The Bureau also gave $130 million to service members, veterans, and their families that were harmed by predatory financial practices. And it made credit card costs more transparent, saving consumers more than $16 billion in fees.
So Abby Phillips, CNN White House correspondent, is with us now, as well as Errol Lewis, CNN political commentator and political anchor for Spectrum News, Gabby Morgiello, White House correspondent for the Washington Examiner, and Joey Jackson, CNN legal analyst. Thank you, gang, everybody, for being here. So much to talk about. Joey, I want to start with you, and I want to read to you what Senator Warren said yesterday on Twitter about Corday's decision to appoint Leandra English. She said, "President Trump can't override that. He can nominate the next CFPB director, but until that nominee is confirmed by the Senate, Leandra English is the acting director under the Dodd-Frank Act." She's right. The Dodd-Frank Act does speak to this, but Joey, from a legal standpoint, who's going to be running this agency Monday morning?
Good morning, Christy. Good morning, panel. Don't you love politics?
Yeah.
I believe who will be running it is the person who Trump nominated to do it. And here's why. Now, clearly there's a classic, and it's not too uncommon, discrepancy between two different statutes. Of course, you have the Consumer Protection Financial Affairs Agency, and it says, hey, listen, you know what? In the event that the director leaves, the deputy director can step up. But it also says, in that little quotation, it says unavailable or absent. And so technically, does a resignation mean that you're unavailable and or absent? Well, that's the question. But then there's that Vacancy Act, which allows the president to make an appointment in an agency. And I think that as long as the president, Christie, has control of both parties, what do? If there's any dispute, you change the law. So I think the courts will be loath to get into this. I think this is more classified as what we call a political question in constitutional law. And I think it's something that'll be resolved. But if you have the President of the United States saying, hey, I want you, even if it's a person who said it's a sick, sad joke, the agency, I think the President generally would get what the President would want, irrespective of the party. But as long as they control both houses, I don't see this as an issue.
All righty. So, Errol, I want to go to you because Joey just brought up a very good point we want to talk about. Mick Mulvaney at one time criticized the CFPB as a sick, sad joke. He's a former South Carolina congressman who co-sponsored legislation to shut this agency down. Let's listen to what he said.
It's a wonderful example of how a bureaucracy will function if it has no accountability to anybody. It turns up being a joke, and that's what the CFPB really has been in a sick, sad kind of way, because you've got an institution that has tremendous authority over what y'all do for a living, over your businesses, over your members.
So, Errol, what do you prognosticate for us here? What do you or others expect this agency is going to turn into in the future if he's at the helm?
Well, if he's at the helm, we can expect him to at least try to hollow it out, try to make sure it doesn't do much of what was just described by Martin Savage. And frankly, that wonderful partial explanation of some of the recent greatest hits by this agency explains why Rick Mulvaney and a bunch of others on Capitol Hill have been trying to kill it, which is that it's a very effective agency. And they've gotten tens of billions of dollars into the hands of consumers that was improperly taken away from them. Whether you're talking about service members, whether you're talking about student loans, whether you're talking about, in some cases, black borrowers who were discriminated against, there are large groups of people who have gotten lots and lots of money back that was improperly denied them or sort of skimmed off the top when it wasn't supposed to be. And as long as you have a hostile Congress and now apparently a hostile administrator who's going to be running this agency, it will become a shadow of its former self, which is really too bad.
Gabby, essentially, it's an aggressive watchdog. It's a consumer watchdog. It's got broad power to combat financial abuses, but it's a critical agency. A lot of people see it for consumers. Is it strong enough in some capacity, though, to survive? Is there a sense of that?
Well, the Treasury Department under this administration has already signaled that it wants to significantly scale back the responsibilities of this agency and the what it has on a day-to-day agenda in terms of its duties and whatnot. And so it wasn't really a surprise that President Trump would appoint Mick Mulvaney as the interim director of this agency, considering he has been highly critical of its operations and what it should stand for and what it should promote in terms of consumer protection. And so I do think that there's a risk that we are going to see it, as Errol said, hollowed out under the Trump administration, likely to the point that it would just be obsolete, that it wouldn't be the same agency that it was under the Obama administration. And then the president could always make the argument that, well, this agency isn't doing anything and we should probably just repeal it legislatively.
Okay. Abby, I want to move on with you here to the Time magazine versus President Trump, it seems. The President Trump, I just want to remind everybody what he tweeted yesterday. Time magazine called to say that I was probably going to be named Man Person of the Year like last year, but I'd have to agree to an interview and a major photo shoot. I said probably is no good and took a pass. Thanks anyway. Time responded saying the president is incorrect about how we choose Person of the Year. Time doesn't comment on our choice until publication, which is December 6th. So do I understand this correctly? Time is basically saying essentially that the president concocted this, that they don't have a photo shoot and an interview beforehand, and it's a surprise to everybody on December 6th?
Well, it's clear that Time is pushing back very hard on what the president is claiming in that tweet. And there is some truth to the idea that maybe they might reach out ahead of time, or that it's known ahead of time who the person is. But what they're essentially saying is that they don't reach out and say, you're only going to be named if we get an interview. So it's unclear what's going on here. We do know that the president has been named Person of the Year in the past, and that he's particularly interested in Time magazine. He is interested in a lot of magazines, always kind of is focused on how many times he's been on the cover. So this is no exception. It's not clear whether he was trying to get ahead of something here, knowing that maybe he wasn't going to be Person of the Year and is trying to sort of say, well, I don't want to be Person of the Year anyway. It's just very unclear, but Time is definitely making it clear that this is not how they operate. They do not call someone and say, hey, we've got to have an interview, we have to have a photo shoot in order to name you to that position.
Sure. So, Errol, I want to look at some of the reactions, particularly from celebrities who are having a little fun with this. Julia Louis-Dreyfus, for instance, tweeted, the New York Times just called to say I was probably going to be named Comedian of the Year. I said probably is no good and took a pass. Thanks anyway. We then have Mark Hamill, a.k.a. Luke Skywalker, of course, say Time magazine called to say that I was definitely going to be named Man of the Year, but I'd have to agree to leak major episode and spoilers. I said no problem. But then they told me you turned it down, and now I don't want it anymore. Thanks anyway. It's comical on the surface, no doubt, Errol, but is there some erosion, some damage of some sort to President Trump with all of this?
Well, I mean, there's damage to the presidency and to the notion that what was once a very high and respected office where you'd never even consider the level of kind of foolish back and forth and sort of self-centered musings to be official statements out of the White House of the past, well, it's now part of the new normal. And the fact that he immediately places himself on a plane where other comedians using the very same platform can ridicule him says something about what the president's choice is. His unfortunate habit of trying to always weigh in on popular culture and become sort of a commentator-in-chief instead of leading the nation.
Mm-hmm. Abby and Joey, thank you both so much. Cheryl, Gabby, I know you're going to stick around. The total time thing, though, it certainly it adds more intrigue to who's going to be Person of the Year at the end of the day on December 6th. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy.
Speaking of intrigue, it should be a major moment for Ivanka Trump on the world stage. But will infighting within her father's administration overshadow her trip to a global summit?
Also, Egypt says the mosque attackers were carrying ISIS flags when they massacred more than 300 people in a deadly attack yesterday.
Also, the nation's healthcare crisis and its impact on rural America. As more hospitals close their doors, residents are forced to travel hours just to see a doctor.
I think that because we're so...
Investigation is moving closer to the president's inner circle. Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has until Monday to turn over more documents to the Senate Judiciary Committee.
And President Trump will be on Capitol Hill to push tax reform next week. He's meeting Tuesday, in fact, with Senate Republicans ahead of their expected vote. But infighting in the Trump administration is threatening to overshadow a major global summit here. State Department officials tell CNN the U.S. is not sending a high-level delegation to next week's Global Entrepreneurship Summit in India. And the main reason? Secretary of State Rex Tillerson doesn't want to support Ivanka Trump, who's leading the U.S. delegation to the event. That's what sources are saying. CNN's Michelle Kaczynski broke this story down for us with the details.
Okay, so what we're talking about here is the Global Entrepreneurship Summit. It is a big event. It's put on by the State Department. And this year, first daughter and senior White House advisor Ivanka Trump is headlining it. She leaves this weekend. She was invited by the Indian Prime Minister himself, and the theme is women's entrepreneurship. But what we're hearing now from several sources, including senior ones inside the State Department, as well as a source close to the White House, is that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and his inner circle don't want to send senior people because they don't love the idea of Ivanka Trump leading the U.S. delegation here. From a senior State Department official, they, meaning Tillerson and his staff, won't send someone senior because they don't want to bolster Ivanka. It's now another rift between the White House and state at a time when Rex Tillerson doesn't need any more problems with the president. And from a source close to the White House, Rex doesn't like the fact that he's supposed to be our nation's top diplomat, and Jared and now Ivanka have stepped all over Rex Tillerson for a long time. So now he's not sending senior people from the State Department to support this issue. He's not supporting Ivanka Trump. When you look at this event in past years, President Obama attended more than once. Secretary of State Kerry, last year it was Kerry, an undersecretary and assistant secretaries of state. But these sources are telling us that Tillerson and his staff aren't letting anyone above the deputy assistant level go. And that originally the acting assistant secretary for this region was slated to be on the trip, and that she was then pulled by Tillerson and his staff. And, you know, when I asked a State Department spokesperson, who are the senior people going on this trip, and the list hasn't been officially published yet, they did give me a short list of the top U.S. government officials, but none of them were from the State Department. There was an ambassador, but that person's already in India. So now you could say, all right, this event was an Obama-era creation. The current State Department's trying to slash its budget left and right, and there is no permanent assistant secretary for this region. But the answers that we get back from our sources are, well, if you're going to send a smaller delegation, fine, but wouldn't you send your senior people and cut back in other ways? We did get an on-the-record statement finally from the State Department, and it says this: the department is committed to supporting women's economic empowerment and entrepreneurship. The summit is a prime opportunity to showcase the importance of these themes. The summit is really about the more than 1,500 entrepreneurs, investors, and supporters. But they are obviously there not commenting on this perceived Tillerson-Ivanka snub, and they're not denying any of this either. Michelle Kaczynski, CNN, Washington.
Thanks, Michelle. Laid it out very nicely. Let's talk with our panel now about all of this. And here to do just that, Errol Lois. He's the CNN political commentator and political anchor at the Spectrum News. And Gabby Morangiello, who is the White House correspondent at the White House Examiner. Good morning. Happy post-Thanksgiving to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, Errol, let me start with you. Is this palace infighting, or is it budget cutting and a sense of financial responsibility at the State Department? What's your pick?
Honestly, Martin, it looks like a little bit of both. It's extraordinary. The New York Times has some recent reporting on this as well. How much has been done to the State Department as far as positions that are left unfilled? It's startling if you think about it. The president just went on a 12-day trip through Asia, and there's still no permanent assistant secretary of state to cover that region. By one count, apparently something like 10 of the top 44 positions at the State Department have been filled, and the rest are still vacant. So with thousands of diplomats being pushed out of service, they're expected to leave by the end of next year, it looks like you're going to be shorthanded no matter what happens. For the Secretary of State, however, to try and pick a political fight with Ivanka Trump, of all people, seems like something you'd have to call palace intrigue, because we know there's probably going to be a reaction from the White House.
But, Gabby, I mean, Rex Tillerson is the Secretary of State, and yet at times it does feel like maybe Ivanka and Jared Kushner have been kind of stepping on his turf here. So do you think this is the right way for Mr. Tillerson to sort of handle his frustrations?
I don't know that it's necessarily the right or mature way to handle his frustrations, but I do think you have to feel for Rex Tillerson. I mean, he has been watching Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner basically behave as though they are the de facto secretaries of state in this administration. We've seen Jared Kushner negotiating peace deals in the Middle East and making routine trips to Saudi Arabia. We've seen Ivanka Trump taking the seat at the UN for her father and interacting with diplomats and global leaders on these foreign trips. And those are typically roles and traditionally roles that the Secretary of State has fulfilled. And so I do think that there is a bit of frustration that's warranted. I don't know that stripping Ivanka Trump of a high-level delegation for a trip that is very important for this White House, entrepreneurship has been something that they've promoted heavily, is the right way to go about doing that.
Errol, let me switch subjects here. President Trump is heading to the Hill on Tuesday to meet with Senate Republicans on tax reform. The Senate hopes to, I guess, vote next week, but quite a few senators have expressed concerns. So here's the question. Does the GOP have the votes to get this done?
I'd be surprised if they come up with it, to be honest with you, Martin. I mean, in some ways, this looks like a replay of their attempt to undo Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. You have senators who are, to their credit, being very forthright and very forthcoming about the problems that they have with this bill, with what they'd like to see changed. And they don't have enough of a margin to lose more than 2 Republican senators. They, of course, have, it's important to point out, tied their own hands by trying to make sure they don't need a single Democrat in either the House or the Senate to come along with them. And so they've tailored the bill very narrowly. And what that does is give an outsized amount of power to each and every Republican member of the Senate. So when you hear various people, including a couple of opponents of the White House who have said that they're not running for re-election and therefore have nothing to lose politically, when you keep hearing Corker and Rand Paul and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins sort of saying that they've got serious problems with this, unless those problems got fixed over the holiday, I think they're going to have a real hard time getting to 52.
And yet, Gabby, the president already seems to be setting his sights beyond tax reform. He says once that's all done, the GOP is going to take up, wait for it, repeal and replace Obamacare. There are major risks to keep going back to this, aren't there?
Well, not only are they planning on going back to Obamacare, they are planning on tackling welfare reform, and they still have an issue to work out as far as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program goes, that DACA immigration program. So they do have a bit of a heavy month ahead of them in December and going into the new year. But I think that what we're going to see play out here is likely a situation that we saw with Obamacare, where the Senate ended up voting on what was dubbed a skinny repeal overkill bill. Basically stripped out everything that was controversial in that first bill that they tried to replace Obamacare with. And that's probably what could happen with tax cuts. We could get down to just a bare bones piece of legislation that cuts taxes, cuts the corporate rate, and maybe includes the individual mandate to offset some of those costs.
And someone who may be voting on whatever comes forward next will be the next senator from Alabama, which is in question. Monday's the deadline for voters to register there. Roy Moore's campaign just released this new ad. Let's take a look first.
5 state campaigns, 40 years of honorable service. Roy Moore has been intensely scrutinized and not a hint of scandal. But 4 weeks before the election, false allegations, a scheme by liberal elites and the Republican establishment to protect their big government trump. But we know a vote for Roy Moore means conservative judges, tax cuts, and rebuilding the military. Roy Moore, right choice.
So, Errol, is this the right way to go when you're facing these accusations and weeks away from voting?
Well, first, Martin, a quick fact check. There was more than a hint of scandal. The man was thrown out twice as the head of the Supreme Court in Alabama for failing to uphold the law. We've got, I think, in this case, somebody who is reading the polls accurately. There's public polling, probably private polling that supports it in greater detail, that voters are willing to overlook the sex scandal that he's currently involved in because they want certain other things from him. They want a Supreme Court vote. They want somebody who's going to be solid on the Second Amendment rights that they care about so much in the conservative South. And if he can get folks to sort of buy into that, he has a better than even chance of winning when the election comes around in December.
Gabby, do you agree with that? I mean, you know, we just saw that spot where you see that Roy Moore sort of against all of the establishment. Does that play well in Alabama?
Well, if you listen to the Alabama voters, both immediately after the scandal in the past few weeks as it's played out, they definitely still stand by him. There are some that are calling into question the validity of these allegations. There are others who say, I wouldn't vote for a liberal Democrat, as our own president said earlier this week. And there are some who just simply, as Errol said, they're single issue voters, and they want somebody in there who's going to vote against a pro-abortion legislation, who's going to support Second Amendment rights. And I do think that that's what they truly care about. But the question isn't what happens to Roy Moore in terms of this election. It's what happens to him if he gets to the Senate. And I think that's where all eyes are going to be. The Republican
All Saturday. We want to tell you about Jake Hawk and his family. They find themselves in this unique situation. Jake's an offensive lineman on the Navy football team. His dad and 2 brothers, though, they are all Army. We've heard of houses divided. This is one of them.
The reason I wanted to serve is because my whole family has served. From, if you like generations, it's all Army, Army, Army. I mean, and my brothers, they were both serving at the time. My dad, he's retired, 20 years in the Army.
Anybody that can love my son as much as they love him, I have to support them wholeheartedly. To talk to his brothers, they'll say, go Army, beat Navy, but we support Jake.
My mom's stance on support is always with me. And to my understanding, she'll be a Navy fan for the rest of her life.
I root for Navy. That's it.
The Army-Navy game in this household is it's an important game.
The Army-Navy game last year it was a tough time.
His heart is crushed, so that upsets me.
I've never felt that bad after a loss. I don't think I'll ever feel that bad after a loss again. My brothers definitely rubbed it in.
I spoke to my other sons who were like, well, Mom, we're in the Army. And all I could say was, but you didn't play in that game.
Thanksgiving this year is going to be, I don't know, I'm not really sure what to expect because we're all going to be back together for the first time in a long time.
There's always a little trash talk. They can't help themselves. It's who they are.
Until May of 2019.
News right now out of Egypt. The number of people killed in that horrifying massacre at a mosque has climbed to 305.
This as Egyptian officials say that the attackers were carrying ISIS flags and automatic machine guns when they surrounded the mosque and its entrances.
That happened yesterday, but meanwhile, Egypt's Air Force launched airstrikes. Take a look at this. These airstrikes on the attackers and, quote, terrorist outposts containing weapons and ammunition. We have a detailed report for you in just a moment, but first.
The agency that is tasked with helping you safeguard your finances is leaderless.
Once the clock struck midnight, as you were sleeping most likely, Richard Cordray stepped down from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Here's the problem. His replacement depends on who you ask is the replacement. A lot of confusion this morning over who is leading the top U.S. consumer watchdog agency, and here's why. President Trump tapped White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney to be interim chief of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or CFPB. The announcement came, though, just hours after the outgoing director, Richard Cordray, an Obama appointee, formally resigned and named his chief of staff, Leandra English, the successor, which essentially makes her the acting director. The appointments of two officials to the same post sets up a political and legal clash here, and the question of who's in charge when employees return to work on Monday. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, who helped create the CFPB, tweeted this. The Dodd-Frank Act is clear. If there's a CFPB director vacancy, the deputy director becomes acting director. Donald Trump can't override that. But the administration can appoint a current government official into a new job as long as they're confirmed by the Senate under the Federal Vacancies Act to serve in an acting capacity. So the CFPB was created after the 2008 financial crisis to protect consumers and keep an eye on Wall Street. Republicans argue the agency has too much power, not enough oversight, and establishes what they see as anti-business regulations. Mulvaney's been a longtime critic. While serving in Congress, he voted in favor of killing the agency and once called it a sick and sad joke. President Trump will ultimately nominate a permanent director. The opening is a chance for a major overhaul of the Bureau.
So what does the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau actually do for you? Well, according to the Joint Economic Committee on Capitol Hill, the watchdog group has several accomplishments aside from just taking on Wall Street. More recently, it forced Wells Fargo to pay full refunds to customers after employees set up those phony accounts. The Bureau also gave $130 million to service members, veterans, and their families that were harmed by predatory financial practices. And it made credit card costs more transparent, saving consumers more than $16 billion in fees.
Abby Phillips, CNN White House correspondent with us now, as well as Julian Zelizer, CNN political analyst, historian, and professor at Princeton University, Sarah Westwood, White House correspondent for the Washington Examiner, and Joey Jackson, CNN legal analyst. Thank you all for being here. I know a big group today. Abby, I wanted to start with you because as we hit Monday morning, this watchdog group may have no idea who to report to. What are you hearing about how this is going to play out?
Well, we're expecting the White House in the next couple of hours to really push back on what Richard Cordray did on his way out the door yesterday. And they're going to really double down on their interpretation of the president's ability to go ahead and appoint Mick Mulvaney as an interim successor. I think the White House believes that they have that power to do that, and that Richard Cordray can't just say who his successor is. So I don't think that they see this as a legal dispute. However, clearly Democrats on the Hill are going to push back. And this is also going to make it much more likely that the president needs to move very quickly to get a replacement into that agency. The sooner he does that, the sooner he'll have a Senate-confirmed candidate, and they can move on with fresh leadership and resolve this issue once and for all.
All right, so Joey, that brings me to you. Senator Elizabeth Warren yesterday said this about Cordray's decision in a tweet. President Trump can't override that. He can nominate the next CFPB director, but until that nominee is confirmed by the Senate, Leandra English is the acting director under the Dodd-Frank Act. This is, the Dodd-Frank does speak to this, but Joey Jackson, in legal parameters here, in the legal arena, who's going to be running this agency on Monday?
I think the simple answer, Christy, is whoever the president wants to run it. And here's why I say that. I think the merits, the politics, and the objective are on the president's side. So even in the event that there's a legal dispute, think of all the wonderful things the agency does, as Martin Savage pointed out. If there's a standstill, it does nothing. And so from the president's perspective and his party's perspective, that's great. You don't want regulation of business. But to the merits of the issue, I mean, he's the president of the United States. The president gets to appoint people. And in terms of the actual rule of Dodd-Frank, it says if the director is absent or unavailable. It doesn't say if the director resigns. And so that's another interpretation. And I think also, Christy, courts are loath to get involved into political disputes. And finally, on the politics of it, when you have the president, who's a Republican, House Republican, Senate Republican, change the law in the event that it's that much of an issue. And so I think at the end of the day, the president gets what the president wants with regard to this dispute.
All right. So while he was South Carolina congressman, here is what he actually, Mick Mulvaney actually co-sponsored legislation to kill this agency. Let's listen to what he said then.
It's a wonderful example of how a bureaucracy will function if it has no accountability to anybody. It turns up being a joke, and that's what the CFPB really has been in a sick, sad kind of way, because you've got an institution that has tremendous authority over what y'all do for a living, over your businesses, over your members.
All righty. So, Julian, I want to point a couple of things out here. It's not the first time somebody's been put in charge of an agency that they weren't exactly a cheerleader for. For instance, we have EPA Director Scott Pruitt, remember. He actively fought against the EPA. We've got Secretary of Energy Rick Perry, who at one point didn't necessarily know the specific responsibilities, I guess, of the energy agency, but he wanted to eliminate it at that point. What do you make of the pattern we see of the president putting people in charge of agencies that they're not passionate about?
Well, it's a very consistent and effective tactic. We saw this under Ronald Reagan. We saw this under George W. Bush. When there are regulations and government bodies that a conservative president like President Trump opposes, and you can't simply dismantle them, you put people in charge who will either not run them effectively or not run them at all, or make sure that the mission is not accomplished. And this has been very important to the Trump administration. And while we're focused on the tweets, I think the administration has been moving to staff many of these agencies with opponents of the agencies. And it can be devastating to the policy.
It makes you wonder where the agencies are headed in terms of their effectiveness. Sarah, I want to move to something that's caught a lot of people's eye, this reaction to the president's tweet claiming that Time is considering him to be Person of the Year. Here's what he tweeted, just so we're all on the same page. He said, Time magazine called to say that I was probably going to be named Man Person of the Year like last year, but I'd have to agree to an interview and a major photo shoot. I said probably is no good and took a pass, thanks anyway. Here's how Time responded. They say the president is incorrect about how we choose Person of the Year. Time doesn't comment on our choice until publication, which is December 6th. So, Sarah, help us all understand here. Is Time basically saying that the president concocted this idea that he was asked for an interview and a major photo shoot beforehand?
No, I don't know that I would read Time's statement as a denial. They didn't say that Donald Trump was never under consideration. I don't know that any news organization dangles an award or a recognition over someone's head to force them into granting an interview. That doesn't sound like a practice Time or any other news organization would engage in. But certainly, I think that there are a range of that Time could choose for Person of the Year. I'm not sure that it was very unlikely that this unfolded exactly how President Trump said on Twitter. We know that he has a history of recounting events in the most favorable manner towards himself, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle between Time's account and President Trump's account. I don't think that he would make something like this up full cloth, but certainly revisionist history is something that's fluent in. So what really happened between Time and President Trump, we may never know, but the truth is probably somewhere in the middle.
Well, and we should point out there were some celebrity tweets after all of this. In fact, Julia Louis-Dreyfus tweeted, the New York Times just called to say I was probably going to be named Comedian of the Year. I said probably is no good and took a pass. Thanks anyway. Then we had Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker, of course, saying Time Magazine called to say that I was definitely going to be named Man of the Year, but I'd have to agree to leak major episode and spoilers. I said no problem. But then they told me you turned it down, and now I don't want it anymore. Thanks anyway. Julian, real quickly, it's comical on the surface, but is there an erosion or some sort of damage to President Trump here? I only have a couple of seconds.
That's where the story touches a nerve, his credibility, his willingness to stretch the truth. A story like this gets right to the heart of that question, which is much bigger than the Time Magazine cover story.
I gotcha. All right. Well, people will be watching that on December 6th, no doubt, very closely. Abby, Joey, Julian, and Sarah, we appreciate you all so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
In one of the most conservative states in the nation, a Democrat, yes, a Democrat has a chance to flip a Senate seat. But can Doug Jones convince skeptical conservative voters to cross the aisle?
Also, guarding President Trump's financial records, an insider at the IRS talks about the unprecedented security to protect the president's tax returns.
We decided we should actually turn it into a safe in a locked room. And so we'll
chance to win that seat.
Well, I'm with you on those polls because I've been spending a lot of time in Alabama covering all of this, so there is skepticism on those. Ben, Roy Moore just released a new ad. First, let's take a look at it, then we'll talk about it.
Sure.
5 state campaigns, 40 years of honorable service. Roy Moore has been intensely scrutinized and not a hint of scandal. But 4 weeks before the election, false allegations, a scheme by liberal elites and the Republican establishment to protect their big government trump. But we know a vote for Roy Moore means conservative judges, tax cuts, and rebuilding the military. Roy Moore, right choice.
This is such a classic ad, it almost seems cliche, but is it going to work, Ben?
Well, I certainly think it's going to work with a lot of his base. I mean, here's the thing. If you pander too much, whether you're the opponent or Roy Moore, it's going to get you in trouble. And so I think what you're seeing Roy Moore do here is actually a smart political play. And this has nothing to do with what he's accused of. I'm just saying politically, you put out a campaign ad acting as if everything is okay, everything's normal, and reminding people how long they've been voting for you in Alabama, and there's a very good chance that this could pay off for him. I think this race is probably a lot tighter than the polls are showing there. I also think that there's, a lot of people think that Jones has pandered a little bit too much. He's tried to, go after voters that were never going to vote for him. His whole entire objective should be, let me make sure that every single Democrat in the state is going to come out and vote for me, and that should be enough to get me over the top. If he continues to go out there and try to, go for too many people that were never going to vote for him in the first place because of this controversy, I don't think he'll win this thing. And so for Moore, this is a pretty simple, smart play. Go back to your base, go back to the people that have been voting for you for 30, 40 years, and remind them of what you've done politically, and maybe they'll overlook, all of these other issues, which, again, it's Alabama. They don't have a history or record of voting in Democrats. You heard a lot of those callers on talk radio. I do my shows carried in Alabama and Birmingham. There's a lot of people that said, you know what, I'm not voting for that Democrat. I don't like Roy Moore and what he did, but I don't want a Democrat representing me for the next 6 years in Congress, and that seems to be what a lot of conservatives are saying there.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the polls I think the race is much tighter than the polls suggest. Julian, we're going to switch subjects here, pivot a bit. Major development in the Russian investigation. Lawyers for the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn no longer sharing information with the president's lawyers, and this means that Flynn could be cooperating with Special Counsel Mueller's investigation or planning to plead guilty. Who should be worried about this development?
Well, I think everyone higher up in the White House will be worried about a story like this, whether it's Jared Kushner or whether it's the president himself, because obviously the implication of the stories and the implication of the news is that they are getting Flynn or trying to get Flynn to cooperate. And in exchange for lenient treatment of him, he can give information about higher-ups if that information exists. So when a story like this breaks, everyone in the upper levels of the White House will be nervous about what exactly Flynn is up to and what his attorneys are willing to deliver in exchange for protection.
Yeah, I definitely think there are some anxious moments now to come. Ben, I want to read you this tweet that comes from Norm Eisen. He chairs the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, and he said, quote, I negotiated a cooperation deal for a target with Mueller's office when he was U.S. attorney. And let me tell you, he's not going to give one to Flynn unless he implicates someone up the ladder. And that means Kushner, Don Jr., or Big Daddy. They are all having indigestion tonight. He's speaking from experience here. Do you think the White House should be really worried?
It sounds to me like a Christmas list of what he's hoping. And so he's saying, you know, back in the day when I did something, this is how it went down. Look, I think Flynn right now is going to do everything he can, maybe even just to protect his son. And that could mean that he falls on the sword. We know that's something he's been very concerned about. If I was at the White House, look, you know the conversations you had with Flynn. I don't think that they're as concerned as some people want them to be or are trying to make this out to be. I think Flynn clearly crossed the line. I think his son is probably in trouble. That may mean that Flynn says, okay, I'm willing to say more, do more, take more responsibility for my actions. But I think there's a little bit of wishful and hopeful thinking there by many on the left who are saying, oh, this is going to be, you know, finally the smoking gun that's going to bring down this White House. I don't see it.
Patty, would you agree with that? I mean, or do you think that there really is serious concern here?
I think there's definitely concern here. You know, I worked in the Clinton White House when we had a special counsel investigating Whitewater, and, you know, we didn't do anything really, and we were concerned because you don't know who's saying what to whom, you know, what they're saying about you. And here in this instance, it seems from what we're hearing, from what's already come out of the Mueller investigation with the indictments of Manafort and Gates and the guilty plea, that there is something there. And it seems to me that Mike Flynn has something to offer the investigation. And so I would think if I were working in the White House, they already have some indictments. They're clearly working towards more, and Mike Flynn is willing to cooperate. I would be very, very nervous if I worked in the White House right now.
Julian,
hold
on, Ben. Hold on just a second. Julian, is this creative leaking on somebody's part? Is it meant to instill this kind of discussion and fear?
Well, yes, that is part of the intention of this, and that's part of how special prosecutors work. They try to create that level of unease, and it's not the wrong thing to do always, so that you hopefully shake up testimony and shake up comments from people involved in the investigation. And you send a signal that you're very serious about who you're going after, and you create this kind of unease intentionally. So yes, that's exactly what this is supposed to do.
Ben, I interrupted. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, remember, whether it be Papadopoulos or whether it's, you know, his former campaign chairman, those that have been indicted, all of those indictments have revolved around non-campaign issues. And we had the same conversation just a couple weeks ago when Manafort was indicted about the White House has got to be nervous and terrified. This is the campaign chairman. Again, those were with their business dealings, many of them going back more than a decade. So I say the same thing I said then. You got to look at what's on paper here. And I think if you look at Flynn, who does he want to protect? He wants to protect his son. And I think this is more about a family issue than this is about the White House. The same way that Manafort and his assistant and others around them, they got indicted for nothing that involved the campaign. Nothing that involved collusion. The word collusion wasn't even in their indictments.
All right, Ben, we got to leave it there. I'm sorry, just because time is a factor here. You got him the last word. Patty Solis Doyle, Ben Ferguson, and Julie.